Caesarea, a judgment hall. Two of the most powerful men in the region are sitting in front of him, a governor and a visiting king. And the prisoner in chains is doing all the talking. He tells them about a light on a desert road, a voice out of heaven. A dead man who didn't stay dead. He tells them he used to hunt people like himself for a living, dragging believers to prison, approving executions. And now here he is, on trial for his life, because he can't stop preaching about the very man he used to hate. The governor cuts him off. "You're out of your mind, Paul." That's the actual reaction. Not "I disagree," not "make your case." You've lost your mind. From where Festus was sitting, that was the only reasonable conclusion. A brilliant, trained, respected man, throwing away his reputation, his safety, maybe his life, over a crucified carpenter from a backwater province. Lesson 2, the message of the cross. Here's what's strange. Paul knew exactly how he sounded. He wasn't oblivious to it. In fact, he'd already written it down years earlier to a church in a city just as skeptical as that judgment hall, Corinth. He told them plainly, this message is going to sound like foolishness to some people, and he didn't apologize for it. That's lesson 2. Not despite the fact that the cross sounds foolish, but because of it. Let's open our Bibles. Memory text 1 Corinthians 1 verse 18. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. One word carries the whole verse. The Greek word behind foolishness is mōria. It's where we get our English word moron. Paul isn't softening it. He's not saying the cross sounds unconventional or countercultural. He's saying, to the watching world, it sounds stupid. And notice, it's the same event, the same fact, the same cross, producing two completely opposite verdicts. To one group, foolishness. To another, power. Same evidence, different verdict. Keep that word, verdict, in your pocket. We're coming back to it. Sunday, the gospel of the cross. 1 Corinthians 1, 17-31. Paul opens by telling the Corinthians something almost backward for a church planter. I wasn't sent to baptize. I was sent to preach the cross. That's not Paul downgrading baptism. Some in Corinth had turned baptism into a status symbol, bragging about which leader dunked them, as if that made them more spiritual. Paul cuts through it. It was never about who did the baptizing. It's about the one you were baptized into. Then he says something that would have made a Corinthian wince. He refused to preach with wisdom of words. That phrase is a direct shot at Greco-Roman rhetoric, the polished, performative public speaking that Corinth prized the way we prize a viral TED Talk. Paul had used that approach in Athens, actually. Logic, philosophy, a philosopher's toolkit. And in Athens, it barely made a dent. So in Corinth, he changes strategy completely. No polish, no rhetorical fireworks, just Christ and Him crucified. Here's the tension worth sitting in. Paul isn't saying eloquence is evil. He's saying eloquence can substitute for the actual message. You can make a room feel something without the cross ever being the reason they felt it. And if that happens, Paul says, the cross has been emptied of its power, drained out, replaced by your cleverness instead of God's. Ask yourself where that shows up today. It's not just a stage and a microphone anymore. It's a caption on a Reels post, a well-produced worship set, a perfectly argued apologetics thread. None of those are wrong, but every one of them can quietly become the point, instead of a window that lets people see the cross. Monday, foolishness to those who are perishing. 1 Corinthians 1, 18-31. Paul uses that word mōria, foolishness, 6 times in this passage. That's not incidental. He's hammering on it. And here's what he's not saying. He's not calling the Corinthians intellectually inferior. Corinth was proud of its sophistication, its philosophy, its rhetoric, its cultural polish. Paul isn't attacking their IQ. He's naming their unwillingness. Not "you can't understand this," more like "you won't let yourself take it seriously." Picture the scene honestly. A Jewish tent maker walks into a city that considers itself the intellectual and commercial center of the region and says, "There was a man executed by Rome as a common criminal, and he rose from the dead, and his death paid for the sins of the entire world." To the Greek mind, trained in Plato and rhetoric, that's not deep. That's not a bold new philosophy to debate. That's just embarrassing. And to the Jewish mind, it was worse. Nobody was expecting a Messiah who loses. The Messiah was supposed to crush Rome, not get nailed to one of its execution devices. So Paul is preaching into a message that both of his audiences find, for different reasons, absurd. And yet, people believed, Jewish and Gentile. Paul's takeaway for us isn't expect people to get it right away. It's God already has people out there ready to hear this, in places that look every bit as resistant as Corinth did. Don't let the resistance convince you the message doesn't work. It never worked by sounding reasonable to begin with. Tuesday, power to those who are being saved. Here's a detail almost nobody catches on a first read. The Greek word translated perishing in verse 18, apolemy, can also mean destroying. So that phrase, those who are perishing, could just as accurately read, those who are destroying themselves. That reframes the whole verse. The cross doesn't cause their ruin. It just reveals a ruin that was already underway, self-inflicted, long before the cross ever showed up to name it. And on the other side of that same word stands this phrase, us who are being saved. Present tense, ongoing, not we saved ourselves. The passive voice matters here. Salvation is something done to us, not something we accomplish. Destruction, on the other hand, is something we do to ourselves. That's the whole gospel compressed into one Greek verb doing double duty. Ruin, self-caused. Rescue, God-given. Back to our courtroom. Picture two people standing in front of the same judge, hearing the same verdict read aloud. One walks out condemned. Not because the judge was unfair, but because the evidence against them was already overwhelming before they ever entered the room. The other walks out free, not because they earned it, but because someone else's record was credited to their name. Same courtroom, same cross. Opposite outcomes determined entirely by what each person brought into the room. Wednesday, a Messiah crucified. Let's go back to the disciples themselves for a second, because even they struggled with this. Read how they react every time Jesus predicts his own death. Confusion, denial, Peter straight up rebuking him for saying it. These are men who walked with Jesus daily, watched him raise the dead, and they still couldn't process a Messiah who would die. If the inner circle needed time to accept it, we shouldn't be shocked when the cross sounds strange. But here's the turn. It's precisely because this was such a shocking claim that it carries the weight it does. Think about what it reveals. God didn't send a Messiah who conquered through power, because that's the version we would have expected, the version that confirms what we believe about strength. Instead, he sent a Messiah who wins by dying, which means the whole story only makes sense once you accept that God's definition of victory is not the world's. That's not a footnote to the gospel. That's the gospel. Back in Acts 13, Paul stands up in a synagogue in Pisidian Antioch and lays the whole thing out. Christ died, was buried, and God raised him, and through him is offered the forgiveness the law could never give. Same message, same foolishness, now landing on ears that had grown up expecting differently and finding, to their surprise, that it was true. Thursday, Christ, the power and wisdom of God. 1 Corinthians 4, 24-29. Here's where Paul brings the hammer down, and I want to walk through it in 3 moves. First, the wisdom of God and the wisdom of this age aren't just different. Paul says they're incompatible. Not God's wisdom is a deeper version of human wisdom. Not if you're smart enough, you'll eventually arrive at the cross through pure reason. No, human wisdom, left to itself, cannot solve the problem of sin. It never could. It was never built to. Second, notice who God chooses to prove that point. Not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. Corinth's church was mostly not the elite of Corinth, and that's not an accident. If God had built his church out of the smartest, richest, most impressive people, everyone watching would say, "Of course that worked. Look who's running it." Instead, God builds his church out of people nobody would bet on. Third, that's what Paul means when he says the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. God isn't actually foolish or weak. That's the world's verdict on the cross, thrown back at the world to expose how small their measuring stick really was. Go back to the courtroom one more time. Every human court in history measures a defendant by strength, reputation, resources, connections. The kind of case a good lawyer can build. God's courtroom runs on the opposite currency entirely. The people with the least going for them are exactly the ones whose verdict gets flipped completely, from guilty to righteous, on the sole basis of what Christ did on that cross. That should change how you see your own weaknesses. The very things you're tempted to hide, or apologize for, or hustle to compensate for. Those aren't necessarily obstacles to what God wants to do through you. Sometimes they're the whole point. Friday. Further thought. Ellen White writes about this moment in Paul's ministry, describing how differently the cross would have landed on Jewish ears versus Greek ears, anger and ridicule. And yet she says Paul had already been transformed by a revelation of God's love at the cross, so completely that, henceforth Christ is all and in all. That's worth sitting with. Paul wasn't preaching a message he found intellectually interesting. He was preaching the thing that had rearranged his entire life. So, back to that judgment hall in Caesarea. Festus called Paul insane, but a few verses later, King Agrippa says something different. He says Paul had almost persuaded him to become a Christian on the spot. Same speech, same cross, two men reaching two completely different verdicts. That's still happening today. Somebody in your life thinks the cross sounds foolish, and you might just be the only version of that message they'll hear. The next time you feel embarrassed to bring up the cross, remember that you were never supposed to make it sound reasonable. You were only ever supposed to tell it plainly, and let God handle the verdict. Start there. Start with one conversation this week. If this helped you get ready for Sabbath School, hit like, subscribe so you don't miss Lesson 3, and drop a comment. Which verdict have you heard? See you next week as we keep unpacking Corinthians together.